If you had to name one country on Earth that has no business succeeding, this would be it. Surrounded by neighbors that have fought it since the day it was born. Barely any oil, barely any water, a land area smaller than New Jersey, and a population of just over 10 million people squeezed into a strip of the Middle East where the sound of conflict has never fully gone quiet. And yet, Israel is one of the fastest-growing, most innovative economies on the planet. A country with almost no natural resources somehow builds more billion-dollar tech companies per capita than almost anywhere else on Earth. So today, we're exploring the question, how does a nation at war more often than at peace keep getting richer, smarter, and stronger? Let's dig in. Let's start with the map, because geography is where this story really begins. Israel sits at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, just 20,770 square kilometers, smaller than most U.S. states. For thousands of years, this location made it a bridge for trade and culture between ancient empires like Egypt and Mesopotamia. But today, that same location is a curse, as much as a blessing. Narrow borders, flat exposed coastal plains, almost no strategic depth. It's one of the hardest countries in the world to defend, and since its founding in 1948, Israel has rarely gone more than a few years without a war, an uprising, or a full-blown military conflict, including the ongoing conflict with Gaza since 2023. Most countries in that position would be trapped in a cycle of instability. Israel instead built one of the most resilient economies on Earth. In 2024, its GDP was around $542 billion. By 2025, it had climbed to roughly $610 billion, with GDP per capita hitting about $60,000, putting ordinary Israelis on paper wealth levels similar to much of Western Europe. Here's the part that should really surprise you. Israel doesn't have the oil wealth of its neighbors. No massive reserves of gold or diamonds. It does have some resources: oil, shale deposits, natural gas fields like Tamar and Leviathan offshore, ancient copper deposits in the Timna Valley, and it's actually the world's sixth largest exporter of potash, mostly mined from the Negev desert. Mineral royalties alone brought in over $300 million in just the first half of 2024. But none of that explains a $600 billion economy. Resources aren't the engine here. Something else is. Instead of pouring money into heavy industry, Israel made a different bet decades ago. Invest in people, not factories. Education, research, and high technology became the national strategy, a slower, harder path, but one built to last. That bet paid off. Today, high-tech exports make up over half of everything Israel sells to the world: software, medical devices, cybersecurity tools, AI, robotics, telecommunications. In 2022 alone, the tech sector contributed close to $97 billion to the economy, about 18% of the entire GDP. By 2025, tech exports had grown to roughly $91 billion, nearly 57% of all Israeli exports, with software and R&D services alone worth around $80 billion. Now here's what's remarkable. During major escalations like the conflicts with Hamas or Hezbollah, you'd expect investors to run for the exits. Real estate slows down. The currency dips a little. But Israeli startups keep raising money. Companies keep getting acquired for billions of dollars, even mid-conflict. Global investors aren't betting on political stability here, they're betting on raw technical talent. And so far, that bet has never really let them down. Part of this comes down to how fast Israeli policy can move. While many governments get stuck in bureaucracy or political gridlock, Israel tends to react quickly to crises. During the 2008 global financial crash, while other nations were still debating bailout packages, Israel had already adjusted its fiscal policy to avoid a debt spiral. During COVID-19, it became one of the first countries in the world to roll out mass vaccination. Not just because of vaccine access, but because of a health system built for rapid, coordinated response, shaped by decades of operating under constant security threats. And because the domestic market is simply too small to sustain big companies on its own, nearly every Israeli startup is built global from day one, designed for American, European, or Asian users before it ever launches at home. There's one more ingredient: the diaspora. Jewish communities around the world don't just send money home, they connect Israeli entrepreneurs to venture capital, especially out of Silicon Valley, and to international markets, far beyond what a country this size should have access to. Across the political spectrum, left or right Israeli leaders share one unusual consensus: the economy isn't separate from national survival. It is national survival. So policy stays focused on resilience, not spectacle. Here's where the story gets genuinely unusual. In most countries, defense spending is just defense spending money that goes into weapons and stays there. In Israel, the military became something closer to the country's national R&D lab. Take Unit 8200, an elite military intelligence unit, often compared to America's NSA, but smaller and far more agile. It's where some of the country's sharpest young minds are trained in encryption, cybersecurity, AI, and big data years before Silicon Valley would even consider hiring them. And then something interesting happens. When their service ends, these people don't settle into quiet government jobs. They walk straight into the tech industry, launching startups and leading breakthroughs. There is barely a line in Israel between military technology and civilian technology. Programs supporting military to civilian tech transfer have generated billions of dollars in value every year. Radar systems, drone technology, data analysis software, all originally built for defense, get adapted, commercialized, and sold globally. It's not a coincidence that some of Israel's biggest tech success stories have military roots. Checkpoint in cybersecurity, NSO Group in cyber intelligence, Elbit Systems in defense electronics. This tight loop between the military and the private sector is a big reason Israel is considered one of the world's leading cybersecurity powers. The military structure itself is built for speed. Air, land, and naval forces sit under one unified command, allowing for fast decisions based on real-time intelligence. Facing asymmetric threats from groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, the armed forces have repeatedly restructured around smaller, more agile units capable of independent planning adaptability as a core military doctrine, not just a talking point. Military service itself is mandatory for both men and women. The total force sits around 670,000, roughly 170,000 active personnel, 465,000 reserves, and about 35,000 inches paramilitary units. Given current security conditions, mandatory service has recently been extended toward 36 months. That shared experience creates something you can't easily replicate: an entire generation given real responsibility at a young age, trained to coordinate under pressure and make decisions in high-stakes environments. It turns out those are exactly the skills that make someone great at running a startup or a war room. Strategic partnerships add another layer. Israel has deep military and technology cooperation with the US, Germany, and India. The United States alone sent close to $17.9 billion in aid in 2024. Since 1959, U.S. support has totaled over $310 billion, with more than $250 billion of that specifically military. Joint programs like the Iron Dome and David Sling missile defense systems, along with F-35 fighter jet development, keep Israel plugged into some of the most advanced weapons technology on Earth. Despite its small population, Israel remains one of the world's top 10 arms exporters, prized for equipment that's compact, efficient, and battle-tested in real conflict, not just theory. The bigger idea here: Israel didn't wait for peace to start innovating. It innovated in order to survive. Defense stopped being a burden and became a launchpad. None of this works without the education system underneath it. And this might be the most surprising part of the whole story. From elementary school, Israeli students are actively encouraged to question their teachers, challenge assumptions, and argue their point. Unlike education systems that reward obedience and memorization, Israeli classrooms treat knowledge as something to be tested and improved, not simply accepted. Why and what if aren't disruptions, they're the entire point. Schooling is compulsory from age 6 to 16 and free through age 18, with widespread, often mandatory early childhood education. The system is genuinely diverse. State secular schools, state religious schools, independent religious schools, and Arab sector schools all operate side by side, each with different levels of autonomy and funding a reflection of the country's cultural diversity, though one that also creates real challenges around equal quality of education. What doesn't waver is the funding. Even during wartime or economic downturns, education spending stays protected as a matter of national security. Entrepreneurship gets built in early. Israeli teenagers take courses in technology, engineering design, and programming well before university. Some schools run full entrepreneurship programs where students form teams, build business plans, and pitch to mock investors, and it's genuinely common for the founders of Israel's biggest tech companies to trace their first idea back to a school project like this. That builds a very particular relationship with failure. In a lot of the world, a failed startup basically ends your career. In Israel, it's treated as tuition. Investors will often back a founder specifically because their last company failed, because it means they've been tested under fire. Universities reinforce all of this. Institutions like the Technion and Hebrew University aren't separate from the economy, they're wired directly into it, functioning as research hubs that spin off companies. Government policy actively supports faculty and students turning research into real businesses, creating a closed loop where education, research, and industry all feed each other. There's a word for the mindset underneath all this: chutzpah. It doesn't mean arrogance, it means the willingness to challenge convention, take a risk, and ask the question nobody else is asking, even knowing you might fail. It's why so many young Israelis are comfortable working a demanding job by day and building a startup on the side, chasing an idea they know has a real chance of failing. The system doesn't obsess over prestige or which university you attended. What matters is whether you can solve a real problem, so students are pushed to follow their strengths, gain varied experience, and sometimes leave university altogether if they find a better path. In a world that changes as fast as technology does, that flexibility might be the most valuable skill of all. Israel is small. It knows it's small, and it has built an entire foreign policy around compensating for that. The relationship with the United States is the clearest example. From 1959 to 2024, the U.S. has provided around $310 billion in total aid, of which over $251 billion has been military, and under a current 10-year memorandum running through 2028, the U.S. commits roughly $3.8 billion in military aid every year. After the escalation that began in October 2023, that support accelerated fast, including billions in foreign military financing, missile defense supplies, and munitions production support, alongside billions more in emergency and humanitarian assistance for the region. But Israel hasn't stopped at its traditional alliances. Through the Abraham Accords, it established formal diplomatic relations with several Arab nations, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, something that would have seemed almost impossible not long ago. It was the first wave of normalization with Arab states since the Israel-Jordan peace treaty back in 1994, and it opened the door to new trade, tourism, and technology partnerships. Trade with the UAE alone went from around $1.15 billion in the first year of relations to over $2.5 billion the year after, and roughly $4.5 billion by 2024. Israel has also become genuinely skilled at brand building on the world stage, actively marketing itself as the startup nation, showing up at innovation forums, and inviting global investors to see the ecosystem firsthand. Despite recurring conflict, it has worked hard to maintain a stable, predictable, legal environment for foreign business positioning itself, in the eyes of global investors, as an island of consistency inside a genuinely unstable region. That's part of why giants like Google, Intel, Amazon, and Apple have all built research centers on Israeli soil. Then there's the global Jewish diaspora, a form of soft power few countries can match. Networks of scholars, entrepreneurs, and professionals in places like the US, France, Canada, and the UK maintain deep ties to Israel, supporting advocacy, investment, and diplomatic relationships abroad. Diaspora contributions to social services, education, security, and infrastructure back home reached around $1.41 billion between October 2023 and early 2024 alone. That relationship isn't without strain. There are real generational and ideological divides, especially among younger Jewish communities in the West. But it remains one of the most powerful global networks any nation of this size has ever built. And it's not a one-way relationship. Israel also exports its own expertise, agricultural and medical technology, humanitarian aid through development programs active across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, building political goodwill in international forums, while also opening new long-term markets for its high-tech industry. So what actually explains it? Not the size of the land, not the resources buried underneath it. It comes down to a decision, made and remade across decades, to treat crisis not as an excuse to freeze, but as a reason to move faster. That doesn't mean the story is finished or simple. Israel is dealing with real internal fractures, political division, religious tension, a widening gap between rich and poor, and constant geopolitical pressure. What happens next likely depends on whether it can hold the balance between constant innovation and social stability, between a strong national identity and staying open to the world. But if there's one lesson to take from this small, contested strip of land, it's this: geography doesn't have to be destiny. Sometimes the harshest environment is exactly what forces a nation to build something extraordinary. That's it for our first deep dive here on Explore Everywhere. If you learned something new today, hit subscribe, because next time we're heading somewhere completely different on the map. See you in the next one.